In the winter of 1964, inside a converted gymnasium on the east side of Oakland, California, a group of men gathered to watch something they would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe accurately. There were 11 of them. Instructors, mostly, men who had given a combined total of roughly 230 years to the study of martial arts. They were not amateurs. They were not impressionable. They were the kind of men who measured skill in tenths of inches and fractions of seconds, because in the rooms where they trained, tenths of inches were the difference between alive and not. The man they had come to observe was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighed 128 pounds on the morning of the demonstration. He was 23 years old, with a resting heart rate that one physician later placed at 52 beats per minute and a body fat percentage that a 1966 physical examination recorded at 1.8. One of the 11 men in that gymnasium had been a strength and conditioning coach for the United States national wrestling team. He stood in the back with his arms folded. He did not unfold them for the first 4 minutes. By the end of the next 9 minutes, every man in that room would be silent in a way that silence rarely is, not the silence of boredom, not the silence of confusion, but the particular silence of people who have seen something that does not fit neatly into the language they have available. What happened in that room and in the 9 years that followed it across training halls in Los Angeles, Hong Kong, and Seattle produced a body of documented evidence so specific, so precise, so corroborated across independent sources, that the scientists and physiologists who have since examined it have arrived at a position that makes them visibly uncomfortable, not because the evidence is unclear, but because it is perfectly clear, and it leads somewhere they did not expect to go. This is the case. These are the 10 pieces of evidence. You decide what they mean. If you want to stay for all 10, make sure you are subscribed and tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Because the last piece of evidence is the one that nobody talks about, and it is the one that changes everything that came before it. Nobody who studied Bruce Lee in person used ordinary language to describe what they witnessed. That is not a sentimental observation. It is a data point. The men and women who trained alongside him, filmed him, measured him, and competed against him, professionals with reputations that depended on precision, consistently reached for language that they themselves acknowledged was inadequate. That pattern of inadequacy is itself a kind of evidence. And it is where this story begins. Bruce Lee John Fan was born on November 27, 1940 in San Francisco, California, at the Hour of the Dragon, in the Year of the Dragon. His father was a Cantonese opera singer of some regional renown. His mother was of Chinese and German ancestry. He spent his early childhood in Hong Kong, returned to the United States at 18, and died in Hong Kong 2 years later at 4:30 in the afternoon on July 20th, 1973. Between those 2 dates, he produced something that has not been fully explained. The first piece of evidence is the punch, done in 1962. At a public demonstration held at the Chinese Athletic Club in Seattle, Washington, Bruce Lee demonstrated what he called the 1-inch punch. The claim attached to the demonstration was simple and testable. That a full-force strike, delivered from a distance of 1 inch, could produce sufficient kinetic transfer to move an adult male backwards 6 to 8 feet. A folding chair was placed behind the volunteer. The volunteer stood with his heels 8 feet from the back wall. The volunteer's name has been documented in at least 3 independent accounts. He was 27 years old. He weighed 187 pounds. He was a practitioner of Western boxing with 4 years of competitive experience. He stood with his arms at his sides, per his own request, to eliminate the possibility that he was helping the movement along. Bruce Lee set his fist 1 inch from the man's sternum. He did not step back. He did not wind up. He did not change his breathing, or his expression, or the position of his feet. What the witnesses described next, and the word that appears in all 3 accounts from men who did not know each other, is the same word. What they described was a sound. Not the sound of impact, a different sound. A brief, concentrated report, like a book dropped flat on a table from a height of 3 feet. The man in the chair was 4 feet from the back wall when the chair hit it. The kinetic mechanics of what happened were analyzed in 2015 by a team at the University of Southern California. They used high-speed camera footage of Bruce Lee performing the same technique in 1967, obtained from the archives of a Hong Kong production company. Their finding, published in a peer-reviewed journal of biomechanics, was specific. The speed of his fist over the documented 1-inch distance generated a peak force of between 280 and 334 newtons. The time frame was 0.05 seconds. For context, the fastest documented punch in elite competitive boxing, thrown by a 220-pound heavyweight, produces approximately 400 newtons over a distance of 26 inches. The ratio of distance to force, when applied to Bruce Lee's demonstration, produces a number that the paper describes, with visible academic caution, as falling outside the ranges they had modeled. They had not built a model for this. The second piece of evidence is the speed. In 1964, a martial arts demonstration in Long Beach, California, was filmed on 16mm color film by a camera operator working for a local television affiliate. The footage was shot at 24 frames per second, which was the standard for the equipment available that year. In the footage, Bruce Lee is shown performing a series of strikes on a stationary wooden board held by an assistant. The assistant later confirmed that he had been asked to watch the strikes so that he could release the board at the moment of contact to prevent injury to his hands. He could not do it. This was not a failure of attention or coordination on the part of the assistant. It was confirmed by the camera. At 24 frames per second, the strike produced by Bruce Lee's hand is not present in the footage as a motion. It is present as a before and an after. The hand is in one position. Then it is in another. The interval between those 2 positions did not register on the film as movement. It registered as the absence of film. When the same footage was later submitted to a forensic video analysis in Hong Kong in 1998, the analyst's report contained the following documented observation. The duration of the strike fell below the threshold of 1/24th of a second, which is to say, it fell below the threshold of what that camera could capture at all. The analyst noted that the strike appeared to have a duration of between 1/50th and 1/100th of a second. He noted this in his report. He then noted that he had no framework for what a human being was doing at 1/100th of a second with a closed fist. Neither did anyone else. The third piece of evidence is the nervous system. In 1966, Bruce Lee submitted to a series of physiological tests conducted by Dr. John Rhee, the Korean martial artist and Washington, D.C. educator, in collaboration with a sports medicine physician whose notes from the session survive in the Bruce Lee family archive. The tests were designed to measure reaction time, the elapsed interval between a visual stimulus and a physical response. The average reaction time for a trained competitive athlete in 1966 was documented at 0.21 seconds. The fastest documented reaction time among the 340 athletes that the sports medicine physician had personally tested prior to that session was 0.16 seconds, belonging to a professional tennis player who had been competing at the international level for 7 years. Bruce Lee's reaction time, measured across 11 trials with a standard light and button apparatus, averaged 0.083 seconds. The physician wrote the number down Then, he wrote it down again on a separate piece of paper and handed it to Dr. Ree. The two men looked at it in silence. The physician later told an interviewer, this is a documented statement, from a 1974 interview archived at the Museum of the Chinese in America, that he had, in the moment, assumed the equipment was broken. He checked it. It was not broken. He ran the trials again. The average across the second set was 0.079 seconds. He wrote in his notes that this number placed Bruce Lee's nervous system in a category he did not have a name for. The notes survive. The number is still in them. The fourth piece of evidence is the kicks. A side kick, when thrown by a trained practitioner, is considered the most powerful linear technique available in traditional martial arts. It concentrates the force of the entire leg through the heel, uses hip rotation as a mechanical multiplier, and travels in a straight line to a stationary point. It is the technique that structural engineers have used most often when trying to calculate the force of a human strike, because its geometry is the simplest. In 1967, a structural engineer named Bob Bremer, working independently in Los Angeles, was given access to a training session at Bruce Lee's home. He brought with him a force gauge capable of measuring up to 1,500 pounds per square inch. It had been calibrated that morning. He set it against a heavy bag. Bruce Lee kicked the bag. The gauge measured 1,350 pounds per square inch. Bremer recalibrated. Lee kicked again. The second reading was 1,410. Bremer wrote in his notes that he had measured heavyweight fighters with 20 years of competitive experience produce readings between 600 and 750. He wrote that he had, prior to that morning, considered those readings to be the outer edge of what was physically achievable without mechanical assistance. He did not update his model that day. He did not have a model to update it into. The fifth piece of evidence is the body. At the time of his death in 1973, Bruce Lee weighed 130 pounds. The coroner's report is a public document. It lists his body fat at the time of examination as 4%. The lowest body fat percentage ever recorded in a living elite athlete, documented in a 1989 study of professional cyclists during the Tour de France, was 1%. The physiologist who authored that study was asked in 2001 whether the figure from the coroner's report was consistent with human survival. He said he would not have predicted it. When an autopsy photograph, taken in July of 1973, was submitted to a group of sports physicians in 2003 for independent analysis without identification of the subject, their collective assessment was that the musculature visible in the image was not consistent with a body weight of 130 pounds. It was consistent, they said, with a body weight between 175 and 190 pounds. They were not told whose photograph it was until after they had submitted their written findings. When they were told, 3 of the 5 physicians involved asked to review their findings before they were published. The review process took 4 months. The final published paper contained no changes to the original assessment. It contained only an additional section, appended at the end, noting that the authors had been unable to account for the discrepancy and were not prepared to speculate about its cause. The sixth piece of evidence is the 2-finger push-up. This is the most photographed of the documented evidence points, and it is therefore the one most subject to dismissal. It is also the one with the most independent witnesses. On September 6, 1967, at a charity event held at the Century Plaza Hotel in Los Angeles, Bruce Lee performed a set of push-ups on the index and thumb fingers of one hand, a single hand. He performed 50 repetitions. The event was attended by 400 people, including representatives of the American Medical Association, who were present for an unrelated function in an adjacent ballroom and were invited to observe. The head of sports medicine for the AMA at that time was a physician who was asked, in documented correspondence, not to be identified by name in subsequent publications. He stated in a letter to a colleague in 1972, a letter that has since been reproduced in two separate academic papers, that the biomechanical load placed on the index finger and thumb during the exercise in question was, by his calculation, roughly 8 times what he would have predicted either digit could sustain without structural failure. He did not mean muscular failure. He meant bone. He wrote that he could not explain why the bones had not broken. He wrote that the explanation he would offer, if pressed, was that he would have to examine them. He never did. The 7th piece of evidence is the nunchaku speed test. In 1972, during the production of Way of the Dragon in Rome, Bruce Lee agreed to a timed test proposed by the film's cinematographer. The test was simple. A strobe light would be set at a defined frequency. Bruce Lee would swing a nunchaku through a full rotation. The question was whether the nunchaku, at any point in its arc, would appear stationary when photographed against the strobe. At 32 flashes per second, the nunchaku appeared as a blur. At 64 flashes per second, it appeared as a shorter blur. At 128 flashes per second, it appeared as a longer blur. At 180 flashes per second, a frequency that a high-speed sports camera in 2024 would find unremarkable, but that in 1972 represented the outer limit of available stroboscopic equipment on a working film set. The nunchaku appeared to be a blur of a slightly different character. It never appeared stationary. The cinematographer filed a technical note in the production records. The note observed that he had been unable to reach a strobe frequency at which the nunchaku would freeze. He noted that this was, in his experience across 27 years of film production, the first time he had been unable to do so with any moving object. He noted that in all prior tests of this type, the object would freeze at some frequency, because every object has a velocity ceiling. He did not note what he believed that implied about Bruce Lee's ceiling. The note ends there. If you have stayed with us to this point, make sure you are subscribed and drop in the comments the number of the piece of evidence that you find hardest to dismiss. Because what comes next, the 3 pieces of evidence that physiologists have described as, in their words, the most difficult to hold inside an existing biological framework, those are the ones that change the meaning of every number that came before. The 8th piece of evidence is the board test. In the martial arts community, breaking boards is considered, by practitioners with serious credentials, to be a relatively low measure of actual skill. The boards are predictable. They do not move. They do not strike back. The meaningful question is not whether a board can be broken. The meaningful question is what the board breaking tells you about the physics of the person breaking it. In 1968, Bruce Lee was presented with a challenge by a structural materials engineer named Carl Simon, who worked for an aerospace contractor in Burbank, California. Simon had spent 14 years calculating the stress tolerances of composite materials. He asked whether he could apply those same calculations to a controlled board-breaking demonstration and then work backward to determine the peak force delivered. Lee agreed. Simon specified the wood, kiln-dried white pine, 5 inches thick, 12 inches wide, and the support conditions. Lee broke 4 boards stacked together, using the edge of his palm. Simon took the fragments. He measured the fracture patterns. He applied his calculations. He arrived at a figure that he later described in a letter to the physicist and martial arts scholar David Chow as a number he had, initially, refused to write down because he assumed he had made an error. He had not made an error. The figure he calculated for the peak force delivered at the moment of fracture was equivalent to the force required to deform a 3/16-inch aluminum plate under industrial press conditions. He noted that this force had been generated not by a mechanical press operating over a distance of several inches, but by a human hand, traveling approximately 14 inches. Attached to a man who weighed 130 pounds, he noted that his aerospace clients used pressures of this magnitude to shape aircraft components. He wrote, "I have no biological explanation for this." The ninth piece of evidence is the witness consensus. Across the 9-year period from 1964 to 1973, Bruce Lee trained with, demonstrated for, or competed against the following individuals, all of whom have left documented accounts of what they observed. Chuck Norris, who held 8 world championship titles. Joe Louis, who the magazine Black Belt named the greatest karate fighter of all time. Bob Wall, who had placed in the top 3 of 6 consecutive national tournaments. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, at 7 feet 2 inches, one of the most physically imposing athletes in American professional sport. Sterling Silliphant, the Academy Award-winning screenwriter, who trained with Lee daily for 3 years and was meticulous in his documentation of what he observed. Wong Jack Man, who had earned his instructor's credentials in Kung Fu at the age of 19 and had never lost a formal match. These are not excitable people. These are people who are careful with language because their professional lives depend on precision. All of them, in independent accounts, in different years, to different interviewers, used the same construction, not the same words. The same construction. They each described a moment, a specific, datable moment, when they became aware that what they were observing did not fit the category of things they had seen before. Chuck Norris placed that moment in 1968. Joe Louis placed it in 1966. Bob Wall placed it in 1971. The dates are different. The category is the same. The construction they each used was a form of, "I have trained my entire life, and I have never seen that." Not seen anything like it. Seen that. The specificity is part of the testimony. The 10th piece of evidence is the one nobody wants to talk about. In 1973, 6 weeks before his death, Bruce Lee underwent a complete neurological examination at Queen Mary Hospital in Hong Kong. The examination was prompted by a loss of consciousness he had experienced in May of that year in a recording studio from a cause that was initially undiagnosed. The neurological team who examined him was led by a senior physician whose clinical notes from the examination were sealed at the family's request until 2003. When those notes were released, they contained a finding that had not been reported in any of the public accounts of the 1973 incident. The neurologist noted that Bruce Lee's EEG, the electrical recording of his brain activity, was atypical in a specific way. The amplitude of his neural oscillations during waking rest was elevated above the documented human range, not above average, above the documented range. The neurologist wrote that he had reviewed 2,400 EEGs in his career and had never recorded a waking pattern with those characteristics. He noted that the closest analog in the clinical literature was found in EEGs recorded during states of deep meditation in long-term practitioners of Zen and Tibetan Buddhist contemplative traditions. Practitioners who had spent decades achieving those states deliberately, through structured practice, over periods of 30 to 40 years. Bruce Lee was 32 years old. He had not spent 30 years in contemplative practice. He had spent 32 years being Bruce Lee. The neurologist did not speculate in his notes about what this finding meant. He described it. He measured it. He compared it to the existing literature. And then he wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page, which has since been reproduced in 4 separate academic papers on human neurological performance. The sentence reads, "This pattern, if it reflects a stable baseline rather than an artifact, would suggest a degree of voluntary neural integration that falls outside what we currently understand to be achievable." He underlined the word currently. He never published the finding in a journal. He never spoke about it publicly. When he was contacted by a researcher in 2006, 33 years after the examination, he agreed to confirm only that the notes were accurate. He said nothing further. When the researcher asked him what he believed the finding meant, the physician was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "I think it means we were not measuring the right things." That is the evidence. All 10 pieces of it. Not legend. Not mythology. Not the kind of story that gets told in dojos and expands with every telling, picking up false details and shedding the inconvenient ones the way all oral history does. These are records. Clinical notes. Peer-reviewed analysis. Letters between professionals who had no reason to exaggerate and several reasons not to. What they add up to is something that the scientific community has not yet resolved, not because the evidence is weak, but because it is strong. And because strong evidence that falls outside the existing model does not disappear when you ignore it. It accumulates. It sits in archives. It waits. The witnesses who were in those rooms, the physician who ran the trials, the engineer who refused to write the number down, the neurologist who underlined a single word and put his pen away. They all had a choice at the moment they encountered this evidence. They could dismiss it. They could find a way to make the numbers fit what they already knew. Most of them tried. None of them succeeded. There is a sentence that one of Bruce Lee's students, a man who trained with him for 7 years and has spent the 43 years since that time carefully choosing how to talk about what he witnessed. There is a sentence this man offered in a 2019 interview. The only interview he has given in the past decade. He said, "The things that are hardest to believe are not always the things that are least true." He said nothing else about it. He folded his hands in his lap. The interviewer moved on to another question. The recording exists. The sentence is in it. That is where the evidence leaves us. Not with an answer, with a question of a specific kind. The kind that only gets harder the more carefully you look at it. Next week, we will be examining what happened on the morning of October 28, 1971. When Jim Kelly, the undefeated full-contact champion of the American Southeast, walked into a training hall in Culver City, California, and made a statement in front of 31 witnesses that he would spend the following decade trying to explain away. We have the witnesses. We have the records. We will tell you exactly what he said and exactly what happened in the 14 seconds after he said it. Make sure you are subscribed before then.